The bank employee did not ask me if I approved the transfer. She asked me if I knew about it. I still remember those words because they were the first sign that something in my life was changing. I was standing in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, holding a cup of coffee and looking at the backyard of the home my wife and I had spent years creating together. It was a normal morning. The kind of morning where you expect to think about work, dinner plans, or weekend errands. You do not expect a phone call that makes you question everything you thought you understood. My name is Ethan Walker, and for 18 years, I believed Rachel and I had built our marriage on trust. We were not a perfect couple, but we were a team. We bought our first house together, worked through difficult seasons, planned for retirement, and saved for the future we imagined sharing. Money was never just money to us. Every dollar represented time, effort, and sacrifices we had made together. That was why the phone call felt so unusual. The bank representative was polite and professional. She simply wanted to confirm whether I was aware of a large transaction request connected to one of our accounts. At first, I assumed there had been a mistake. I thought maybe there was a misunderstanding with the paperwork or a routine issue that needed clarification. I thanked her, ended the call, and opened our account information. That was when I saw the details that changed the way I looked at everything. There was a financial action involving our shared accounts, and Rachel's name was connected to it. I stared at the screen for several seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. The amount was significant, but that was not the part that affected me the most. The hardest part was realizing I had not heard about it from my wife. After 18 years together, you learn the small patterns of another person. You notice when conversations change. You notice when someone becomes quieter about certain topics. You notice when questions that used to be shared suddenly become private. Looking back, I could see there had been signs. Rachel had recently asked more questions about account access. She wanted to understand how quickly money could be moved and what options were available in different situations. At the time, I thought it was responsible. I believed she was simply becoming more involved with our finances. There was nothing wrong with wanting knowledge or independence. Everyone wants to feel secure. But the difference between independence and secrecy is communication. And that was the part one could not ignore. I did not immediately call Rachel. I did not send an emotional message. I did not accuse her of anything before I understood the full situation. Years of working as a financial analyst taught me something important. When information does not make sense, you slow down and look at the facts. So I sat at my kitchen table and began reviewing everything carefully. I looked at our history, our plans, and the decisions we had made together over the years. The more I looked, the more I realized the issue was deeper than a financial transaction. The money was only what brought the problem to the surface. The real question was why the person I trusted most felt the need to make such an important decision without me. And that was the moment I understood something difficult. I was not just investigating an account. I was trying to understand when my wife and I stopped planning the same future. For 18 years, I believed I knew Rachel better than anyone else in the world. I knew the way she liked her coffee in the morning. I knew the little habits she had when she was thinking about something. I knew the stories from her childhood, the goals she had for the future, and the dreams we had created together. That was why the situation felt so confusing. The person connected to the financial decision was not someone outside our family. It was the person I had spent nearly 2 decades building a life with. After reviewing the information from the bank, I decided not to make assumptions. I wanted to understand what had changed. I started looking back at the months before that morning and noticed things I had previously ignored. Small details that seemed meaningless at the time began to feel different when I connected them together. Rachel had always been careful with money. She was responsible and thoughtful, and I respected that about her. We both believed in planning ahead. We both wanted to make sure our family would be prepared for unexpected situations. But recently, her conversations about finances had started to sound different. They were no longer only about our shared goals. They became more focused on individual security. One evening, we were sitting in the living room after dinner when Rachel brought up the idea of making sure both of us had personal plans for the future. At first, I agreed with the idea. I believed everyone should feel confident about their own ability to handle challenges. Independence is not a bad thing. In a healthy marriage, two people should support each other while also maintaining their own strengths. But then Rachel said something that stayed with me. I think everyone needs to know they can be okay on their own. I looked at her and asked what made her think about that. She paused before answering. I just think people need to be prepared. Her answer was not wrong. In fact, it sounded reasonable. But something about the way she said it made me feel like we were discussing two different futures. I was thinking about how we could prepare together. She sounded like she was preparing separately. I tried to convince myself that I was reading too much into it. After all, people change. Concerns change. Priorities change. A person wanting more independence does not automatically mean they have stopped caring about their marriage. But the feeling remained. There was a distance growing between us, and I could not explain exactly when it started. I began noticing other moments too. Rachel became more private when discussing certain financial topics. She asked questions about access to accounts and procedures that I had never heard her ask before. Again, none of those things alone proved anything. A person can ask questions because they want to be informed. A person can want to understand their own finances better. But when those moments happened repeatedly, I started wondering if there was a bigger reason behind them. That was the hardest part. I did not want to see Rachel as someone who was trying to hurt me. I still remembered the years we shared and the life we built. I still believed there was a reason behind her choices. But understanding someone's reason does not remove the impact of their actions. That night, after Rachel went to bed, I sat in my office and looked through our financial information again. I was not searching for evidence against my wife. I was searching for clarity. Because before I could decide what to do next, I needed to understand one thing. Was this just about money, or was it a sign that something deeper in our marriage had already changed? The more I looked into the situation, the more I realized that the hardest part was not the financial information itself. It was accepting that I had missed the signs right in front of me. When you spend 18 years with someone, you naturally believe you understand their thoughts and intentions. You create a picture of your relationship based on thousands of conversations, shared experiences, and everyday moments. You do not expect that one day you will have to question whether you are still looking at the same picture. After that morning, I started paying closer attention to the details I had previously dismissed. I remembered conversations that seemed ordinary at the time. Rachel had mentioned wanting more control over certain parts of her life. She talked about having her own plans and making sure she was prepared for unexpected changes. I supported that idea because I never wanted my wife to feel powerless or dependent. A strong marriage should allow two people to grow individually while still building something together. But there was a difference between having personal confidence and creating separate plans that affected both people. That difference was becoming clearer. I decided to review our financial history carefully. As a financial analyst, I knew the importance of looking at patterns instead of reacting to one event. I organized the information, reviewed past decisions, and compared them with what had recently changed. I wanted to understand the full picture before having a serious conversation with Rachel. The more I reviewed, the more I noticed that the shift did not happen overnight. It had been gradual. There were moments when Rachel asked questions about our accounts that seemed unusual. There were times when she appeared uncomfortable discussing certain financial topics with me. I remembered asking if everything was okay, and she always reassured me that she was simply thinking ahead. At the time, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Trust is built on giving someone the benefit of the doubt. But trust also requires honesty when something does not feel right. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in my home office long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The room was quiet except for the sound of the clock on the wall. I looked at the documents in front of me and thought about how strange the situation felt. This was not just a financial review. This was a moment where I had to decide how much I truly understood about the person beside me. I thought about the early years of our marriage. I remembered how Rachel and I used to talk about everything. We discussed our goals, our worries, and our plans. There was a time when we did not need to ask if we were on the same page because we naturally were. Somewhere along the way, that changed. The most difficult realization was that the problem probably did not begin with a financial decision. It began when we stopped sharing our fears with each other. Rachel had concerns she kept private. I had concerns I did not notice soon enough. We were both carrying thoughts that should have been conversations. The next morning, I decided I would not approach Rachel with anger or accusations. I wanted answers, but I also wanted understanding. Before I could decide what this meant for our future, I needed to hear her side of the story. Because behind every action, there is a reason. And I needed to know whether Rachel was trying to protect herself from me, or whether she was protecting herself from a fear she had never told me about. The next few days were some of the quietest and most difficult days I could remember. Not because anything dramatic happened on the outside, but because my mind was constantly trying to understand what was happening beneath the surface. I continued going through my records, but I also started paying attention to Rachel herself. I wanted to understand her feelings, not just the financial decisions that had created so many questions. After 18 years together, I knew there had to be more to the story than a simple desire to move money. People do not suddenly change without a reason. There is usually something happening beneath the choices they make. One evening, I decided it was time to have the conversation I had been avoiding. Rachel was sitting in the living room, reading through some emails on her tablet. The television was on in the background, but neither of us was really paying attention to it. I sat across from her and took a moment before speaking. I did not want my first words to sound like an accusation. I wanted them to create a space where we could actually talk. "Rachel, I need to ask you something," I said. She looked up and immediately noticed the seriousness in my voice. "What is it?" she asked. I told her about the information I had found and explained that I was confused because I had not known about the decision. I watched her expression carefully. At first, she looked surprised. Then she became quiet. It was not the reaction of someone who had no idea what I was talking about. It was the reaction of someone who knew this conversation was coming eventually. "Ethan, I was going to talk to you about it," she said. Those words were difficult to hear. Not because they proved anything, but because they confirmed that there had been a conversation waiting to happen. "When?" I asked. She looked down for a moment. "I do not know. I just needed time to think." I understood needing time. Everyone needs space to process important decisions. But the problem was that this decision involved both of us. It involved the life we had built together. Rachel explained that she had been feeling uncertain about the future. She talked about moments in life when people suddenly face unexpected changes and realize they are not prepared. She said she wanted to feel confident that she would be okay no matter what happened. Listening to her, I started to understand something I had not considered before. This was not only about money. It was about fear. Rachel had been carrying worries that she had never shared with me. But understanding her feelings did not mean I could ignore how her choices affected me. I told her that I respected her desire for independence. I wanted her to feel secure. But I also needed her to understand that trust works both ways. When one person makes major decisions alone, the other person does not just lose information. They lose the feeling of being included. The conversation lasted for hours. We talked about things we had not discussed in years. We talked about stress, expectations, and how easy it is for two people to become disconnected while still living the same life. For the first time in a long time, we were not just talking about schedules, bills, or responsibilities. We were talking about us. By the end of the night, I still did not have every answer. I still did not know exactly what would happen next. But I understood something important. Rachel was not simply trying to create distance. She was trying to find security in a way that hurt the person who wanted to stand beside her. And that was the moment I realized the biggest problem was not the financial decision itself. The biggest problem was that somewhere along the way, we had stopped feeling like partners. After our conversation that night, I realized that understanding Rachel's feelings did not mean I could ignore the reality of what had happened. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I finally understood where her concerns came from. She was not acting because she wanted to hurt me. She was acting because she was afraid of a future she could not control. But at the same time, I had to be honest about my own feelings. Fear could explain a decision, but it could not erase the impact that decision had on our relationship. I spent the next few days thinking carefully about what I needed to do. I did not want to make choices based on disappointment or frustration. I wanted to make sure that whatever I did came from responsibility and respect. My goal was not to punish Rachel. My goal was to make sure our shared finances were handled properly and that both of us had a clear understanding of what was happening. As a financial analyst, I knew the importance of preparation. In my professional life, I had spent years helping people organize their financial decisions and protect their long-term goals. But this situation was different because it involved someone I loved. It was much easier to analyze numbers on a spreadsheet than to analyze the actions of the person sitting across from me at the dinner table. I began carefully reviewing our financial structure. I made sure I understood every account, every responsibility, and every option available to us. I wanted to have accurate information instead of assumptions. I wanted to know exactly where we stood before making any further decisions. During that process, I also made sure everything was documented clearly. Not because I wanted to create a conflict with Rachel, but because clarity matters when emotions are involved. When people feel uncertain, misunderstandings can grow quickly. Having accurate information allows people to have better conversations. Rachel noticed that I was spending more time organizing things. One evening, she walked into my office and saw the documents on my desk. She looked at me with a concerned expression. "Are you preparing for something?" she asked. I understood why she asked. From her perspective, she had been making plans quietly, and now she was seeing me doing something similar. I looked at her and answered honestly. "I am making sure we both understand where we stand." She stayed quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you think I was trying to leave you out?" That question was harder to answer than I expected. Because the truth was complicated. I did not believe Rachel wanted to destroy our marriage. I did not believe she woke up one day wanting to betray me. But I did feel excluded. I felt like a decision that affected both of us had become something she carried alone. "I think you were trying to protect yourself," I told her. "But I think you forgot that we were supposed to protect each other." Those words stayed between us. Rachel did not respond immediately. She looked at the documents on the desk and then back at me. For the first time, I think she understood that the problem was not simply about the financial decision. It was about what that decision represented. It represented a moment when two people who had spent years building a life together started preparing for different possibilities. Over the next few days, I continued making sure everything was organized. I followed the proper steps and focused on responsibility rather than emotion. I knew I could not control every choice Rachel made. But I could control my own actions. And for the first time since this began, I felt like I was no longer just reacting to what was happening. I was making thoughtful decisions about the future I wanted to protect. The days after that conversation felt different. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because the silence between Rachel and me was finally starting to disappear. For weeks, we had both been carrying thoughts we never shared. We were trying to protect ourselves in different ways, and neither of us realized how much distance that was creating. Now that the truth was finally out in the open, we had a chance to understand what happened and decide what we wanted moving forward. I continued reviewing our financial situation, but I approached it differently. Before, I was looking for answers because I felt uncertain. Now, I was looking for clarity because I wanted both of us to understand the reality of our choices. There was a difference between protecting myself and building a wall between us. I did not want this experience to turn me into someone who only saw Rachel as a problem to solve. She was still the person I had shared my life with for 18 years. She was still the person who had stood beside me through important moments, difficult seasons, and countless ordinary days that became meaningful because we experienced them together. One evening, Rachel and I sat down again to talk. This time, the conversation felt different. There was less defensiveness and more honesty. She admitted that she had been thinking about worst-case scenarios for a long time. She explained that she had watched friends go through difficult situations and realized how quickly life could change. She wanted to feel prepared. She wanted to know that she could handle unexpected circumstances. Listening to her, I realized that her fear was real. It was not something I could simply dismiss. But I also explained that fear becomes dangerous when people handle it alone. A marriage is supposed to be a partnership where both people can talk about their worries before those worries turn into separate plans. Rachel listened quietly. Then she said something I had been hoping to hear. I should have talked to you before making decisions that affected both of us. That sentence meant more than she probably realized. It was not an apology that erased everything. It was an acknowledgement that the way something is handled matters just as much as the reason behind it. I also had to admit my own mistakes. I realized that I had assumed Rachel felt secure because I believed I was providing stability. But security is not only created through financial planning. It is also created through emotional connection. I had focused so much on solving practical problems that I sometimes forgot to ask what was happening inside her mind. That realization was difficult because it meant accepting that both of us had contributed to the distance between us. Over the following weeks, we started changing the way we communicated. We scheduled time to talk about finances, not just when there was a problem, but as part of our normal routine. We discussed goals, concerns, and expectations openly. We stopped assuming the other person already understood what we were thinking. Slowly, the tension that had filled our home began to fade. I knew rebuilding trust would take time. Trust is not repaired by one conversation or one promise. It is rebuilt through consistent actions. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like Rachel and I were standing on the same side again. The experience had changed us both. I no longer saw the situation as only a financial issue. I saw it as a warning sign that showed us something important about our relationship. We had spent years building a life together, but even strong foundations need attention. And now we had the opportunity to rebuild that foundation with more honesty than before. The hardest part of rebuilding trust was understanding that trust is not only about believing someone will make the right choice. It is also about creating an environment where both people feel safe enough to share their fears before those fears become decisions. After everything Rachel and I had discussed, I started seeing our situation differently. I was no longer focused only on what had happened. I was thinking about why it happened and what we needed to change if we wanted our marriage to become stronger. For years, I believed that because Rachel and I loved each other, communication would naturally happen. I assumed that after 18 years together, we would automatically understand each other's concerns. But I learned something important. Time together does not guarantee connection. Connection requires effort. It requires two people choosing to be honest, even when the truth is uncomfortable. One weekend morning, Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked about the future. It was the same table where we had planned vacations, discussed home projects, and made countless everyday decisions. But this conversation felt different. We were not talking about what we wanted to buy or where we wanted to travel. We were talking about who we wanted to become as a couple. Rachel admitted that she had been afraid of depending too much on someone else. She explained that seeing other people experience unexpected changes in life made her question whether she was prepared enough. She said she never wanted to feel helpless. I understood that feeling because everyone wants a sense of security. Everyone wants to know they can handle difficult moments. But I also told her that there was a difference between protecting yourself and protecting yourself alone. When you share a life with someone, major decisions affect more than one person. They affect the trust between two people. Rachel listened carefully. Then she asked me a question I did not expect. Did you ever feel like you were carrying everything by yourself? I thought about it for a moment because the answer was complicated. I had always believed I was the person responsible for planning, organizing, and keeping things stable. But the truth was, there were moments when I also felt pressure that I never expressed. I realized that while Rachel was keeping her fears private, I was doing something similar in my own way. I was trying to be strong instead of being open. That conversation changed something between us. We started understanding that the problem was not one person against the other. The problem was two people who had stopped sharing the thoughts that mattered most. Over the next several months, we worked on creating better habits. We reviewed our financial plans together. We talked about individual goals while still respecting our shared future. We made sure important decisions became conversations instead of surprises. It was not always easy. Some conversations brought up uncomfortable emotions, and some topics required patience. But every honest conversation helped rebuild something that had been damaged. I also realized that protecting myself did not mean I had to stop trusting Rachel completely. It meant learning that healthy trust includes communication and accountability. A strong relationship is not built because two people never make mistakes. It is built because both people are willing to recognize mistakes and make changes. Looking back, the situation that first felt like a threat to everything we had built became a lesson about what our marriage needed. Rachel and I had spent years creating a life together, but now we were learning how to create a stronger partnership within that life. The biggest change was not in our finances. It was in the way we finally started talking to each other again. As time passed, I started to realize that the most important lesson from everything that happened was not about protecting a bank account. It was about understanding what happens when two people who love each other stop feeling comfortable enough to share their fears. Rachel and I had spent years building a life together, but somewhere along the way, we both became focused on handling problems separately. She created her own plan because she wanted security. I created my own response because I wanted stability. We were both trying to protect our future, but we forgot that the future we were protecting was supposed to belong to both of us. After our conversations became more honest, I noticed small changes in the way we interacted. We started asking questions instead of making assumptions. We started explaining our thoughts instead of expecting the other person to understand automatically. Those changes may have seemed simple, but they made a bigger difference than I expected. A relationship is often affected by small moments. A question that is never asked. A concern that is never shared. A decision that is made alone because someone believes it will be easier than starting a difficult conversation. I understood that now. One evening, Rachel and I looked through some old photos from the early years of our marriage. We saw pictures from our first home, family celebrations, vacations, and ordinary moments that had become meaningful over time. Looking at those memories reminded me that our relationship was not defined by one difficult period. It was defined by everything we had experienced together. That did not mean we could ignore what happened. It meant we had to learn from it. Rachel told me that she wished she had talked to me sooner. She admitted that keeping her concerns private only made the situation more complicated. She said she was so focused on making sure she would be okay that she did not realize how her actions made me feel. Hearing that mattered because it showed that she understood the emotional impact, not just the practical details. I also shared something I had learned about myself. I had always believed being responsible meant having answers and solving problems. But I realized that sometimes responsibility also means being willing to admit when something hurts. It means allowing another person to understand what you are feeling instead of silently carrying everything. We both had to become better at that. Over time, our conversations about money became less uncomfortable. Financial discussions were no longer something we avoided until there was a problem. They became part of how we planned our life together. We talked about goals, responsibilities, and expectations. We made sure both of us felt included. The situation that once created distance between us eventually became something that helped us understand each other better. That was not because the experience was easy. It was because we chose to face it honestly. I learned that trust is not something you simply have forever because you have been with someone for many years. Trust is something you continue building through everyday actions. It requires openness, respect, and the willingness to listen. Looking back, I still remember the morning when the bank called me. I remember the confusion and the questions that followed. But I no longer see that moment only as the beginning of a difficult chapter. I see it as the moment that forced Rachel and me to stop pretending everything was fine and start creating a healthier relationship. Sometimes the events that challenge us the most reveal the things we need to change. And sometimes protecting what matters most requires more than securing what we own. It requires protecting the connection between the people who share it. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized the most important thing I protected was never a number on a screen. It was the ability to trust, communicate, and understand the person standing beside me. The morning I received that unexpected call from the bank changed the way I looked at my marriage, but it also changed the way I looked at myself. I learned that even strong relationships can experience moments of uncertainty. What matters is how two people choose to respond when those moments arrive. For a long time, I believed that being a good husband meant always having a solution. I believed my responsibility was to create stability, plan carefully, and make sure the people I loved were taken care of. Those things were important, but I learned there was another responsibility that mattered just as much. I needed to create a space where honesty could exist, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Rachel and I were not the same people we were when we first got married. Over 18 years, people change. Their fears change. Their priorities change. Their understanding of security changes. The mistake we made was not changing. The mistake was failing to talk about those changes together. When Rachel made decisions without me, I felt like I had lost my place as her partner. When I responded by quietly preparing without fully sharing my emotions, I created distance in my own way. We both had moments where we were trying to protect ourselves instead of reaching for each other. That realization became one of the most important lessons from this experience. A marriage is not strengthened by pretending problems do not exist. It is strengthened when two people are willing to sit down, have difficult conversations, and choose honesty over comfort. Today, Rachel and I approach our future differently. We still discuss finances, but those conversations are no longer about control. They are about teamwork. We still make individual plans, but we also make sure those plans respect the life we are building together. We understand that independence and partnership do not have to compete with each other. They can exist at the same time when there is trust and communication. I still remember the feeling I had when I first saw that unexpected financial activity. I remember the confusion, the disappointment, and the questions that filled my mind. At that moment, I thought I was facing a financial problem. I later realized I was facing a relationship problem that had been hidden beneath the surface for much longer. The experience taught me that people do not always hide things because they do not care. Sometimes they hide things because they are afraid. But fear that remains unspoken can create damage even when the intention behind it is not harmful. The lesson I carry forward is simple. Protecting a future is not only about saving money, organizing accounts, or planning ahead. It is also about protecting the connection between two people who have chosen to share their lives. Challenges will happen. Misunderstandings will happen. But the strongest partnerships are not the ones that never face difficult moments. They are the ones where both people are willing to learn, grow, and rebuild when those moments come. The day I discovered something was wrong felt like the beginning of losing everything. Instead, it became the moment when Rachel and I finally started building something stronger. Not because we forgot what happened, but because we chose to understand it. And sometimes, the greatest change in a relationship begins with the truth that was hardest to hear.